Everybody, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Callan Steinman. I'm Curator of Education here at the Georgia Museum of Art. I'm really excited to welcome you to today's Coffee with the Curators program. This is a more sort of informal program. It's a casual kind of chat with our two curators of European art. We have Nelda Damiano, who is the Pierre Daura Curator of European Art, and Julia Kilgore, who is the Pierre Daura Curatorial Assistant for European Art. So they'll both be chatting about a new exhibition that they have recently installed at the museum focused on the art of Pierre Daura. I don't want to say too much about one of our special guests, but we are joined by Martha Daura today, and I'm really excited that she's able to be here from Oregon. And I'll let Nelda give any further introductions. But we'll be spending about an hour together. If you have questions for Nelda or Julia, I invite you to put those in the chat box. And I believe they'll be holding questions till the end. Is that right, Nelda?
Correct.
Okay, so if you have questions throughout the presentation, please add those to the chat and we'll get to them at the end. And so that's sort of the plan for the program. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to Nelda and Julia to take us away.
Thank you, Callan, and welcome everyone. I'm glad you can join us this afternoon, where we'll, as Callan mentioned, we'll talk about one of our latest exhibitions. And I'm joined by Julia, and so I'll ask her some question and she'll ask me some, but hopefully we can cover some ground that will be of interest. And so I'm going to start right away with our little PowerPoint. So this is us. We've already said that. And so what I'd like to do today is essentially tell you a little bit about how this exhibition came about, what was the goal of this exhibition, what was the inspiration, and kind of walk you through a little bit of the curatorial concept development, the choice of artwork, and also talk a little bit, of course, about what we will be looking at and the material we used to gather all this information and this scholarship. So the exhibition started off with this painting that you see on the screen, which was a recent acquisition of a painting by Pierre Daura called L'Église vue du cimetière, or the church at Saint-Cirque-la-Popie, seen from the cemetery. And just to give you the greater context, the bigger context, this exhibition on Daura is part of a new series we started a while ago called In Dialogue. And this series really aims at focusing on a work of art in our collection and bringing it together with other works, so create a conversation or a dialogue to better explain the work that is part of our permanent collection. So this is the first installment of this concept with the Cecilia bow. And I don't know if I move my mouse if you see it, but the central painting is the one that we own. And then the other paintings or studies were part of PAFA, Pennsylvania Art. Oh my God, what is PAFA? No, it's an acronym. We're so used to saying that. Academy of Fine Arts, the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, that's it. So this was the first installment, and this is ours. This is the current one with, again, maybe you'll remember this, but I'll come back to these individual works, but this is the acquisition that was funded by Martha Daura, who's here, and this is what prompted the whole thing. But I have to say right off the bat that I'd already been kind of, going through the inventory of Daura's work. It is hard to miss that this subject matter, the church at Saint-Cirque-la-Popie, was something that was really on his mind, or was a motif that was quite recurrent in his career. So already when we purchased this painting, I thought, this looks familiar because this one is also part of our collection. And of course, when I started gathering all the images of the church at Saint-Cirque, was more than 100 in different points of view. So I could understand right away that this was a very important topic for Daura. But then it also, in the bigger context, made me think of other instances and other artists who have brought forth this idea of repetition or variation of series. And I won't get into the details, the semantics of what we call a series, what we call repetition, what we consider sequence, what we consider variations, but this was something that really took off with modern art. Now, even back in the Renaissance, artists would make a version and then another version and sometimes a third version. Either they would or their workshop would, either to meet the market's demand. So the multiple, so a painting or a motif that is repeated by an artist and created by an artist more than once is not something that appeared in the 19th century, but it's really something that was pursued in the 19th century and developed to an extent that had never been done before because it was something very intentional. So I'm going to look at a little bit of examples with Van Gogh because maybe they're more familiar, but also this is something that he touched on mostly in the last 2 years of his career. He dies in 1890 in July, and these are of 88, 89, essentially, and it is mostly when he's, Van Gogh is in Arles or Saint-Rémy in Provence, so in the south of France. And so this is one of the examples, again, of the same tree, but a different color, different palette. One of the things that scholars have asked themselves about these Van Gogh's repetition, but they apply to other artists as well, is there any way to know the sequence? I mean, unless these paintings are dated and signed, do we know which one came first? But even when they are dated and signed, we know, for example, of artistic practices, like in Van Gogh's case, where he was painting 2 or 3 paintings at the same time. So, he would work on something, turn around, work on something. So it wasn't a thing, these artists didn't necessarily finish one canvas and move over, finish another one. So it is very hard for art historians to establish a timeline when they're confronted with repetitions. In the case of Van Gogh, we do have a lot of letters, and we'll touch on that about Daura because we are fortunate to have an archive. And so some of these questions can be solved, but not all the time. Another important series with Van Gogh was his portrait of Joseph Roulin, who was a postman in Arles, and they became friends. And this is he painted Joseph Roulin 6 times and also produced 3 drawings. And here we see a little bit with the one from Boston here is probably thought to be the first one chronologically in 88. And then the one from MoMA in 89, and again from Colomuller in 89. And we see, of course, the portrait would be the same. It's the same person, but the treatment of the background, of course, is different. And that is the main difference with a bare background, a very ornate background, and then a different background. Now there's the question of, was it a real wallpaper? Was it something created by Van Gogh? Most likely it was. But again, this fascination with taking one subject and observing it over and over and presenting it to the viewer in a different way. So Van Gogh's interest in Joseph Roulin also spilled over to his wife, Madame Roulin, and he painted her 5 times, and these are 3 of the 5 canvases that Van Gogh did. They were both, Joseph Roulin and his wife were dear friends of Van Gogh. He grew very attached to them, and maybe there's also something, emotional and about affection to be read in an artist choosing a same subject over and over again, not just maybe how he can push the boundaries artistically. So chronologically, again, this series has created some problems for art historians. And I think now they've come up with 100 possible sequences of how these were painted. And so depending on the scholar, this one might have been painted first and then this one first. And anyway, but that's not what we're concerned about, or what what I was interested about when I was looking at Daura's work and making bridges with other examples. So again, the most striking thing in these paintings is the background, because the pose and how she's sitting and her hands are very much similar. Another detail that seems to change is the ring, and something it's not quite the same, and other slight differences. But again, this artist is looking at something and trying to capture it in a different way. So Van Gogh painted these in 88, 89, but what really perhaps propelled this idea of repetition is another painter, but I guess I had other examples by Van Gogh. Thank you, Julia, for putting together all these images. And so this is another interesting, almost similar, because we could play at pointing differences between these versions. This is a very important work in Cleveland, another one at the Phillips collection. So this Cleveland painting gave way to an exhibition called Van Gogh Repetition in 2013. And that was another exhibition catalog that inspired me for this talk. But it was essentially, the exhibition was about looking at Van Gogh and the idea of repetition in 13 of his most important paintings. And this one is another good example of Van Gogh. He's at this point, he's in the south of France, and he checked himself into an asylum, and he's looking, through his window, or he's in the park, and he's fascinated with the road menders here fixing this road. And so this one is quite similar. Of course, the choice of color, the palette, some of these details are different, and the overall facture or feel of it. But this figure is here and she's here. These two ladies are here. This group is also here. And so these stones also, they're pretty similar. I think this is the last example. Again, this is now towards the end of his life. He dies 6 months later. This beautiful landscape in Copenhagen, and this one not too far from us at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, again, where Van Gogh is likely standing in the same spot. And this is another thing that I'll touch on about plein air painting, of these artists that went out there, painted, likely finished it in the studio, but the first idea, the first gist, they would be there and painting from nature. But what I was getting to was how the artist who kind of made this his trademark was Monet. So this series of haystacks were exhibited in 1891 at the Gallery of Durand-Ruel, who was one of the most important art dealers of the period in Paris. And Monet exhibited 15 of these haystacks. They were all painted in that year, and he sold all 15 within the first few days of the exhibition. And so again, the same questions that we've asked ourselves about Van Gogh, the boundaries of those questions, or the urgency of those questions, are pushed forward even further by Monet, because this is a series of 15. And again, was it intentional? Was it something, there's no way today, there's a lot of research that has been done, but there's no way to know how they were hung in Durand-Ruel's gallery. So did the artist imagine them to have a particular sequence on the wall? We don't know. We know for sure that he did not paint these to be bought by a single buyer and remain intact as a group. So there wasn't that preoccupation for these artists. And Monet used this device, if I could call it that, for many series, the water lilies, the Cathedral in Rouen, the Venice. And I just put these other two examples of the poplars. So an example here in Philadelphia, an example here in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But really, after 1891, Monet regularly produced these series of repetition course, he was also interested not only in the motif, but in the impact, the changing effects of atmosphere, temperature, light, seasons. And this is something we see in Daura too, with some of the paintings about the church at Saint-Cirque. They were, painted in different moments of the day or different seasons and different years. And this is another thing that art historians have asked themselves: what makes a series a series? Does this, do these paintings have to be made within a specific amount of time, or can they punctuate the artist's career? And in some instance, like Albers and other artists who have tackled repetition, they are spread out on many years or decades. So with this kind of background introduction, I'm going to now turn to more specifically on our example and our exhibition. So you will have heard me say often Saint-Cirque la Popie, Saint-Cirque la Popie. And so even in the exhibition, we thought it would be, in the brochure that's going to be available online, I believe today or tomorrow, we thought it was important to kind of situate people. And, so apparently we forgot about this whole northeast part of France. We didn't really care about what was happening here, but you have Paris and you have Saint-Cirque la Popie and you have Bordeaux, Toulouse, Lyon, so the south of France essentially. And this is the part where I think I will let Julia talk, because Julia did a lot of research online trying to find these very evocative images of Saint-Cirque, because sadly, neither I or Julia have ever been. We were supposed to go, I know I was supposed to go in 2020, but we all know what happened that year. And so I will let Julia talk about Saint-Cirque, because she's also developed a love of Saint-Cirque because she created a mood board on her wall by her office. So her wall is now plastered with Saint-Cirque la Popie images. So Julia, if you don't mind telling us a little bit.
All right, thank you, Nelda. For those of you, my name is Julia. I'm the Pierre Daura Curatorial Research Assistant, so I assist Nelda with the collection. And I really have enjoyed learning about Saint-Cirque and the history of the Daura family. And so in looking up some of these images, I realized just how beautiful this place is. It's a medieval cliffside village. It's about 400 miles south of Paris, as you kind of saw on the map. It's kind of down here, and then there's Paris up here. So it wasn't really near that major center of like Paris, but it's pretty close to Toulouse and some other cities. And it's a medieval settlement on these like limestone cliffs in the Lot Valley. You'll see the Lot River down there in the first image on the left. And because of this, its location and the fact that it was on a cliff, it was actually a very strategic position that made a very great defensive site, which actually helped the village to develop a military presence in the region throughout the Middle Ages. And so in the 10th century, from the 10th century onward, it was the heart of a very powerful vice county created following the division of land owned by the counts of Quercy, the viscount of Saint-Cirque. And so in the 11th century, the vice county was divided into 3 different fiefdoms controlled by 3 families that were vassals for the Count of Toulouse. You have the Lepopis, the Gordons, and the Cadillacs. And so each of them kind of created their own part of like a fort system there. And in the 14th century, a lot of French cities and villages were really kind of on the decline due to the 100 Years' War, the plague, and there were a lot of famine and just a lot of economic problems. But from all accounts, it seems that Saint-Cirque actually thrived during this time period and actually expanded. Building projects were coming up left and right, and they seemed to thrive up until the second half of the 16th century. And then it kind of declined partially due to the French religious wars. Now, this site was really an inspiration to many artists, including Daura, but also his friend Andrey Breton, which we'll get into a little bit later. But we wanted to put out this image for you just to kind of show you a little bit of the village, show those beautiful terracotta roofs, but also kind of get at that relationship between the different artists. Pierre and Andrey were very, very good friends and lived very close to each other. And we'll learn a little bit more about the relationship further on. But this is one of the parts of Pierre Daura's house in Saint-Cirque. So he originally visited the village in 1914 and did some sketches. And he really seemed to enjoy his time there because he returned with his new bride, Louise, who he had met while she was studying art in Paris. Now, Louise is originally from Richmond, Virginia. So they met in Paris, and as part of their honeymoon in 1929, near the end of their honeymoon, they visited Saint-Cirque as part of that trip. And they seemed to really fell in love with this village. And so soon after that honeymoon, they purchased a home. And so it was really kind of one of their great inspirations that you can kind of tell working through the archives, talking about these different letters back and forth. They truly seem to love this place. And his daughter, Martha, was born there in 1930. And even after they moved to Virginia later on in life, they would often come back to visit this village. And I'll let Nelda tell you a little bit more about one of the letters that she found.
Yes, so one of the richness that we have and one of the privilege here is that not only we have the collection or an important collection of Pierre Daura's work, but we also have the archive. And so sometimes an archive in which is easy to get lost in, and which is often the best part of my day. And I communicate that with Martha. Sometimes I send her little photocopies or scans of letters that I read, and they touch me and I find very endearing. So there's a wealth of information, but not just information. It's really a privilege and an opportunity to get to know an artist and his artistic process, but also his family, their feelings, the kinds of human beings they were really. And it's a very beautiful portrait that emerges from many of these letters, very obvious the love between these two people. And it transpires in many of the letters, love for their friends, love for their family, love for each other. And it takes someone who's multilingual, because we have letters in French, in English, in Catalan, in Spanish. So this is it would be a good internship for someone studying languages. But and Louis' French is impeccable, and so is Pierre's French. And so it's just a joy. But in the many letters I went through trying to study a little bit more the period of Saint-Cirque, or Pierre's attachment to Saint-Cirque, and even Louise, of course, I found this letter, and which I think says it all. And this was a letter that she wrote to her family, kind of explaining how they had decided as a couple to enjoy their wedding present, which was some financial support that they had received. And so they had decided to invest and buy this house. And so when she said, "Never had I been as enthusiastic about a village in my life. It is enchanted in its medieval atmosphere with not a modern note to break the charm." And I think that even today, if I'm not mistaken, it is probably a few hundred people who live in Saint-Cirque. And so it is remote, but it seems to have everything anyone needs to be happy. And so some of these letters really touch on that. To get more into the gist of the exhibition, again, this is the painting we bought. And this is a version in Perpignan, in the museum in Perpignan, which looks very much like the one we have, except for the part here of the cemetery. And this is an image of Saint-Cirque of the church today. And it almost gives us a clue as to where the artist would have been standing, because it's pretty similar in the vantage point of view. And so again, one of the things that I was trying to find in the archive was something, some recollections, some memories, some comments on Saint-Cirque. And in one letter that Pierre writes to a friend in 55, so again, 55, we're already, more than 25 years after possibly this was made, and this was made as well. So unlike perhaps what we saw in the Van Gogh series that were very, within a very short amount of time, Pierre's fascination and love for Saint-Cirque, or for this church, or his interest in this church, lasted many decades. And so he says here how he tried humbly, and this is a word he uses a lot, which tells a lot about his who he was. So I humbly tried to transpose into painting all that my vision meant. I wanted to tell my friends how wonderfully I felt every morning and every noon and every evening at being able to wonder, to marvel, drinking the blue yonder, the white, the gold, the pinks of the stone, and the ruby, liquid or fluid ruby that are the roofs so steep. So in this small passage of a longer letter, yes, we understand his fascination or his interest in this, but we also see an artist's eye. He's someone who is looking, he's looking very specifically because he sees the white, the gold, the pinks of the stone, which I don't know if us as tourists looking at the church, we would see this. So an artist, even if he is fascinated with a certain topic, there's the exercise, or the observation is something that interested me when I was looking at all these representations. You have an artist that's looking and looking to translate. When he talks maybe about the gold and the pinks and the stone, maybe this is a translation or is an image that evokes that a little bit more. And even in this representation, where you see variations of the colors of the stone, and this again brings us back with this interest in the changing effects of atmosphere, of weather, of season. This beautiful, just gorgeous painting that unfortunately we don't have on the wall because it was not available, because the Spencer Museum actually, they're packing up and they're expanding. So they're moving their collection. And so the collection was not, it was out of reach. But this, of course, is a snowscape, and very different in feel with the one we have here and with others. Also, much more of a zoom in. He's doing a close-up. We see it from, and this is another thing that we see with these many representation of the church, is that they're closer, further, they capture more of the, the surroundings. They are in the evening, in the morning, in the afternoon. This is winter. We have other perspective here. This is very interesting, with the shapes also of this kind of course, looking up, and we have the road here. So very interesting of how he would have physically moved or changed his position or his eye, or how he wanted to observe this building in particular. This painting here is from Richmond, Virginia, and this one is in the show. And perhaps just as a guideline, the image you'll see on your, I would suppose their left here, those are the works in the exhibition. And these are the works that we're comparing them to, because of course we only had one wall. And so I very much looked at all these representation. And again, I made some groupings. I was trying to find kind of the same, again, point of view. and to distill it to a selection that would give us different kind of how he was probably rotating around it or standing in a different position. So again, this one very interesting, very dynamic. This painting is very brisk, very swift brush strokes, much more like a study, unlike something like this that is very highly finished. And this one is in the show and is just gorgeous. It's almost, you know, pulsating off the wall a little bit because of what is happening here with these brush strokes. And it seems to move, it seems to be moving. It is very much alive and vibrant. And perhaps this matches more Daura's description in his letter about the gold and the pinks and the yellows of the stone. And just this gorgeous sky. And I have to say, I love these outlines, these blue outlines, and Daura's signature that sneaks up in some of these paintings in different places. So this one is also, in terms of dimensions, one of the biggest painting we have of this subject. I was trying to look at, again, views that are similar. So looking at this surface here, and it's pretty much the same, you know, and I say this because this is different. It's the other side of the church. This is the front, or, you know, this side. So all these kind of moving around, going around. This is a painting in San Antonio, and called Golden Glow. And again, this is something very deliberate by the artist, who's obviously interested in something more than the building, something visual in terms of, you know, how can I transpose what I'm seeing? And I think in this instance, he's very much interested in giving it this, well, golden glow, but, you know, and just the color becomes the feature in this painting, or its use of a very restrained palette. Another thing that's interesting that the Church of Saint-Cyr was represented many times over many decades, but it was also represented in different ways, different techniques, different media. So we have oils on canvas, we have watercolors, we have drawings, we have engravings. And so this is very important too, because it means that the artist was not only trying to capture the physical property of a building or something that interested him, but also a drawing doesn't have the same feel or the same, doesn't project the same effect, and is not rendered in the same way, and does not present the same formal properties than a painting does. So this engraving here is part of our collection. And this is a drawing that is at the Eskenazi Museum in Indiana. And this was one pairing that I had hoped to put together on the wall, but unfortunately, this drawings can be fragile. And this is more, the museum felt that it was too fragile to travel or be exhibited. And this is not something uncommon, especially with chalks or pastel. They're way more, we protect them much more. They're less resistant, let's just say, to fading and discoloration. So, but at least in this small publication that we will have online, you can see, I pretty much believe this would have been the preparatory drawing for the engraving, or at least one of the versions of the drawings that would have been used for the engraving. This part here with the figure is the part that is most different. Again, this, I love these chalk drawings because I always defend drawings and engravings, because people tend to think they can be boring because they're black and white, and but when we look at a pastel, or in this case a chalk drawing, there's the richness of the black against the white, the contrast. So engravings and drawings, but especially engravings, if in some of the exhibition I've put together of only engravings, it is amazing the different tonalities of black, how some feel more velvety and some feel more stark or colder. Some black contrasts are crispier, some fade away. I mean, there is a whole range of hues with engravings, even though they are black and white, but it's very interesting when you put them all on a wall. It's something that becomes painterly, and it's something that feels very much like a painting. The other 4 main works in this exhibition, and this is probably what is closest to a straight up series of a repetition, is really these 4 rendering of Andrey Breton's house. And Julia mentioned Andrey Breton briefly. Breton was one of the most important writers and art critic and philosopher and in France, mostly known for his connection with the surrealism movement. And so Andrey Breton fell in love with Saint-Cirque-la-Popie, like others had before him, and he bought a house and became friends with Pierre. And this is one of the series where his friend captured his home. What I liked about this series, these 4 watercolors are at the Indianapolis Museum of Art, is really you kind of see, it goes from more detail where you see the strokes, and then it becomes a little bit more abstract, and then a bit more abstract, and then a little bit more abstract. So there's a progression here. And when I mean abstract, is, you know, just like kind of these pools of colors. You don't have these lines in the brick here anymore. They're disappeared. So if you were to look only at this, it's much more abstract in terms of trying to make out. I think we could still understand that these are roofs and these are buildings or homes, some architectural feature, but it's not like here where you see this much better. So I don't know if I would assume, but I'm not sure if these were painted one after the other, the same day, in the same week, in the same year. Maybe I'll find some clues to that in the archive. Maybe Martha, you would know something I don't. But this is more of the straight up repetition that was, I would think, likely created in a shorter amount of time. This is, oh, I don't know, do you see the text? Because I see, okay. So this is like, as I mentioned, the friendship between Breton and Pierre. And there's, in the archive, there is an edition, a 1950 edition of André Breton, Poète d'aujourd'hui. The references here and the references in the brochure. And there's a handwritten note by Breton. There's a poem. And so there's the poem in French, and we translated it. There was a translation in the files. And so this essentially speaks to how Breton's friendship and love for his friend, and how he would see him. And this blue smoke, I wondered, is it like putting the coffee pot on? Is it just lighting up the fireplace? I don't know if that's, Martha, if you, I was wondering about this blue smoke because it seems so pretty. And I figured, well, I guess Pierre would get up, start the fire, and begin his day. And so that's my interpretation of it. And so one of the things that it had been translated differently, but I went with Martha translation on this when he says, the smoke veils and unveils a compassionate nature such as I like and know so few of. So again, this fondness for his friend and acknowledging his qualities as a human being. And this is something very recurring in all this correspondence I see in the archive. Apart from that series of 4 watercolors from Indianapolis, Julia and I, then we were playing this game of Find Dora's house, Find Breton's house in these landscapes. So it's this one, correct? And then it's this one. And then it's this one today that we found an image of. And when Andrey Breton, he passed away before Pierre did, and Pierre, expressed his sadness in a letter he wrote from Virginia to the Friends of Saint-Cirque-la-Popie, which was, Société des Amis de Saint-Cirque-la-Popie, that obviously was Pierre was maintaining ties with. And so the death Neil has sounded. Andrey Breton and I were born the same year, the same day, the same time. We shared the devotion to Saint-Cirque-la-Popie. We had both fallen in love at first sight with the same site, the same rocks, the same roofs that seemed to fly like butterflies. So a very endearing homage to his friend. And there are also other, these are just little passages of these letters that are longer, but that was another challenge, trying to find the passage or that would encapsulate everything the letter was saying. And I guess this is the end of our current presentation, but I'm happy to take some questions, but also Julia, if you wanted to add anything at this point.
Well, I would like to add that we do have a finding aid for the archive, and a finding aid allows, basically it is a list of the boxes and sections of the archive to allow researchers to discover kind of like what's in the collection. And so I will leave that link in the description so that you can discover the archive yourself.
Yes, yes. And again, this was part, using the archive, using that resource was another thing that was paramount with this exhibition. Unfortunately, there's always a lack of time to keep digging, or there's a lot of reading material, but the archive is very well organized thanks to someone I will not name, but it is very detailed. And again, this is one of the goals of this exhibition, was to highlight our new acquisition, of course, to try to link an artistic practice to something, to other artists. So again, this idea of repetition that is not unique to only one artist, and also to emphasize the resource that the archive is, and how it can add to our interpretation of these works of art, how it can enrich how we experience them, how we understand them. So this is something that is very valuable for someone who normally works with old masters, and a lot of those archival records have been destroyed by wars or other disasters. It's a luxury to have something like this that we have here at the Georgia Museum of Art, and we try to promote it, and hopefully we've changed the format of the finding now. It's a PDF. It's much more easier to download, to read, and it's also in several spots, places on our website, and we've started a new collaboration with the library to have it on different platforms as well, because it is an active archive. It is an archive that keeps growing. So we still collect, we still corral information. We are still adding boxes. And so this is something very important, because we know what we know. We can only study it as ourselves, but we need that external scholarship, that external expertise from other researchers that make links between Daura and other artists, or will be interested in investigating a particular moment in his career, or someone he worked with, or someone he mentored, someone he taught to. So the visibility of this archive is also something that's very important to our mission here, for me, for sure.
And for myself as well, as somebody who comes from both like an archival background and a museum background, just kind of experiencing this collection, I'm struck at how rich the information is. You have documents on the exhibitions, you have letters from the life of the family, but not only between family members, but with friends and fellow artists. You have so many different types of items. We have books from Pierre Daura's collection. And so it's really this kind of amalgamation of different parts of his life. And it's really, really great opportunity in my mind to just get down and discover more about what kind of made Pierre, and also Louise and even Martha. The images with the photographs are always such a great kind of a discovery of when you can match up photographs with letters. Or in the case recently, I found 2 different letters in 2 different boxes. One of Pierre writing to a friend about Saint-Cirque and really how he came to find it to be home. He writes a poem about how he couldn't really find a place to settle, and he felt like he was wandering from place to place. And then he discovers Saint-Cirque, and it kind of became a place where he could settle and really kind of thrive. And so I found that letter, and not too long after that, I found a letter by Louise to another friend of theirs, a different friend, actually mentioning this poem that he had wrote. And so you see so much about the relationships between the artist and the artist's friends, and between Pierre and Louise and Martha and their family. And it just generates this whole entirely new experience that you can only get through primary sources and through seeing these paintings. So it's been a real joy for me as somebody experiencing this archive.
Yes, well said, Julia. Nothing like primary sources. I'm a big fan. And so, yes, I welcome any questions you have. And also, I would like to invite you to come and see the exhibition, which is up until May. And we will have this material online. If it's not already online, it probably will be today. We are not printing this brochure because of COVID restrictions, although we will be printing a small quantity for the archive, because that's something we collect and we document. Oh, and Martha, I'm sorry I hope I don't put you on the spot, but maybe someone else has an answer for this. Would you interpret the poem when he talks about the blue smoke? Would you interpret it as the chimney, the smoke coming out of the chimney?
Yes, the first thing that was done in the morning was to make a little fire in the fireplace, and we toasted our bread on the coals there. And no matter whether it was summer or winter, we always made toast for breakfast, and we would have pate or jam, things like that on it.
Okay, good, yes. And so I know we were trying to better understand the distance. And so we went through all these Google Maps to understand the distance between Pierre's house and Andrey Breton's house. And then it seemed it was only 200-meter or a 2-minute walk or something. Was it that close?
It was very close, very close.
Because the village does seem quite compressed. And
it is.
Yes.
Because in the medieval days, space within the walls was precious. So every house was by another one.
Right,
they often had 6 inches or so between them as a fire break. But that was about all.
Okay, yes. I mean, again, I think that hopefully this will also inspire people to want to go to Saint-Cirque, although I think that they enjoy their privacy too, and they enjoy how Saint-Cirque is still pretty intact. The Maison Daura has become, since I believe 2005, a place that welcomes international artists. so in the visual arts, but also authors, writers, and they have a residency of several months. There's an application process, but it's something that I know, Martha, you donated to the Région. It is the homes that is made of 2 buildings, I believe, with dedicated spaces for artists to focus on their craft, on their work. And it is something that it's a fellowship. You are supported financially while you are there. And so you can focus on, again, your passion and your craft. And this is, it's a great opportunity, and it continues what Pierre was doing in the sense of being in Saint-Cirque and being inspired. And so the fact that the house now is available for artists from all over the world, and it's still active. It has become, the house is part of Monument Historique, so it's something that is protected. But if you go online and you actually look at the Maison Daura, if you know of any artist, it's still active. I mean, they take application. It's something that is very well known and very sought after. And so that was another thing that's interesting to see. But again, hopefully one day I will see Saint-Cirque. I'm not giving up hope. And then I'm sure all of this will become, more, feel more real, because at the end of the day, we have the paintings, but I can't wait to experience the proximity to the church and the presbytery and kind of understand what's so fascinated Pierre. Of course, the church seems to be the most overwhelming architectural feature of the village, but the fact that this church just shows up in his artistic production more than 100 times is very telling of how he was trying to give it justice and just share it with people.
And we do have a question from the gallery. They were wondering how long the Dauras lived in Saint-Cirque, and I can kind of answer that. So they had settled there soon after their honeymoon in 1929, and Martha was born there in 1930. And they stayed kind of on site there until early July of 1939. Unfortunately, Louise became very ill at that time. And so the family sought treatment in the United States. And so they had moved to Virginia to seek some treatment. Unfortunately, before Louise could recover, or right after she recovered, that was during World War II, and they were blocked from going back to France. And so they eventually settled in Virginia in the United States, and Martha and Pierre became citizens. And this is where Louise's family is from the Virginia area. They lived there in Rockbridge for a while. But even living in the United States, they continued to have that home in Saint-Cirque and would visit very frequently, most summers and at other times, I'm sure. So it's been well documented in the archives of different visits going back and forth.
And Julia, you mentioned the summer spent there, and I think Martha, like, you can confirm that long periods of time were spent in Saint-Cirque, and it was always sort of a back and forth. Or do you remember any time where you stayed years away from Saint-Cirque?
It was not quite every year, because it would depend on state of health of mother or father, or commitments to some project, but they would have liked to go back every summer. They didn't go back at other seasons because father was teaching and there were all kinds of things going on.
Yes, of course, because they had a life in the United States, of course. Yes.
And in teaching at Lynchburg and some of the other places, that would make sense too with the school year as well.
Yes.
Correct. Correct. Yes. I don't know if we have any other questions.
No question, but we do have somebody who's interested with the Spanish literature class to come and visit. And we welcome all visitors for the exhibition. It's a great opportunity to learn more about the artists and our exhibitions, the artwork. And we thank you very much for having that opportunity to come, and feel free to let us know, and we can answer any questions.
Yes.
If I could just add that you, in the archive, you have a Spanish language version of the film on Daura that they might enjoy seeing.
Yes.
Certainly.
Yes, for sure. And we do have, and it kind of overlaps a little bit, or, you know, it can be linked to the current In Dialogue show we have on Daura. We have now an exhibition on 17th century Baroque Spanish painting. And it actually, we have 6 paintings, but 4 out of the 6 paintings are versions of the prototype of an original one. So even, as I mentioned, in the 17th century, in the 16th century, 17th century, the idea of versions existed, but it was never, you know, taking up quite as much as when Monet took it up, and then later artists. Some of it was, of course, highly driven by the art market. And what happened in the 19th century was essentially beyond the official Paris Salon, which was the official exhibition sponsored by the state, the emergence and the proliferation of private galleries. And so you have figures like Durand-Ruel, Ambroise Vollard, all these commercial dealers, art dealers that appeared in Paris and that offered artists another vitrine, another way to exhibit their work. And this really exploded in the 1880s, 1890s. And the role of the art dealers in Paris at the time, and, you know, following that, is really something that changed the course of art history as we know it, or the art market, of course, as we know it. I always like to make parallels with the Renaissance, because the Renaissance had an art market, and the main employer was the church. So the church was commissioning all these artists in the 16th century, 17th century, and so on. But what happened in the 19th century with the commercial gallery really changed the landscape and the possibilities for artists. And so maybe in the 16th or 17th centuries, you had 2 or 3 wealthy potential patrons, or people who could buy your work of art, mostly, again, the church or the clergy or royal families. But in the 19th century, once the salon was not your only possibility to reach people and to disseminate your work of art and to exhibit your work of art, but the art dealer and the private galleries came into the picture, then it changed the game completely. And so the fact that Monet painted 15 haystacks, he certainly wasn't, he wasn't dumb. He knew there was an art market. He knew he could tap into that. And so there is some motivation driven by the art market and this idea of repetition. I don't believe that this was the case with Daura, but he certainly would have known of this tradition, been exposed to it. And again, it was just something that ballooned up in the 19th century and 20th century. But in the Spanish paintings, this is why I brought it up now, I remember, because you were talking about Spanish and students. I'm proud to say that for that exhibition, we have the labels and all the wall text are both in English and in Spanish. And so far we've also had 3 visits from students in Spanish classes, literature, history. And so I'm hoping we could do more of that with upcoming exhibitions with bilingual labels. Or so there's a little bit of Spain in other places in the museum, not just with Pierre Daura. Well, thank you again for being here. And I think Julia's going to kind of put the finding aid or that reference. Again, please visit our website for all this information that you've seen about this exhibition. And I want to thank especially Martha for her support, of course, in allowing us to still purchase works of art by her father, supporting us for these initiatives, for these exhibitions. And it was a real treat, Martha, to have you here today. And I'm sorry I asked you a few questions because you're not on the clock, but it's very tempting to ask you. So I hope you'll forgive me.
Well, you did a beautiful job, both of you. Thank you.
Thank you. And join us for our next coffee with the curator.
I will.
All right, perfect. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.